Chapter 9. Cabin Fever. Frank jolts awake with a scream. His arm feels like it's on fire, and he clutches at the bandages. He is covered in sweat and shivering uncontrollably. The room is spinning again, and he bends over off of the side of the bed and vomits. He clutches at consciousness, trying not to faint. Finally, after a moment, the room stops spinning, and he is able to stand up. He doesn't have much strength and staggers his way over to the kitchen sink. He quickly unwraps the bandage and is horrified at the sight of a deep infection spreading up his arm. Reddish-green liquid oozes from the puncture holes, the skin puckering and swollen around the teeth marks. His arm is purple, black, and yellowish. The smell of rotting flesh slips into his nostrils, a deep black color tracing up the veins in his arm. He wipes the sweat dripping off of his forehead and realizes he's burning up with an intense fever. He knows he needs to make a difficult decision before it's too late. He stands there stunned for a moment, trying to collect his thoughts, while lost in a fever. He unbuckles his belt and tightens it around his left bicep, cutting off the circulation. He clutches at the belt around his arm and hurries over to the fireplace with his metal poker and shoves the tip into the embers of the fire. He makes his way over to the kitchen drawer and opens it. Inside is an assortment of knives. He reaches into the drawer and pulls out a hefty cleaver. He regretfully places his infected arm on a large wooden cutting board, located in the corner of the counter, near the sink. He trepidly raises the cleaver, ready to bring it down. A blood-curdling scream fills the cabin as a solid thunk of the blade hits the cutting board. Blood spills from Frank's severed arm. He rushes back over to the fireplace and removes the bright red poker from the embers. He takes 3 deep breaths and presses the blazing metal onto the stump, searing the wound closed. Still dealing with intense fever, he heads over to the front door and flings it open. He lays down in the snow out on the porch and closes his eyes, trying not to pass out from the pain. The wind whips across his limp body as he lays there. His thoughts return to a more clear and normal state now that his body temperature has lowered. Still dealing with the intense fever, he heads over to the front door and flings it open. He lays down in the snow out on the porch and closes his eyes, trying not to pass out from the pain. The wind whips across his limp body as he lays there. His thoughts return to a more clear and normal state now that his body temperature has lowered. He sits up clumsily, trying to get used to the new weight of his balance. The sickening smell of burnt flesh creeps into his nose as he sits there on the porch. He gags and vomits again. After a moment, he stands up and heads back into his dwelling. He returns to the kitchen distraught at the trauma he just faced. Shaky and weak, he looks at his dismembered arm, lifeless on the ground, and can't believe his eyes. There is no sign of a bite mark or infection. Besides being cut from his body, the arm otherwise looks completely fine. He falls to his knees in despair and confusion. What is happening to me? What is going on? What are the wolf tooth I pulled out? He quickly stands up and begins searching around for the tooth. Where did I put it? The tooth is nowhere to be found, and he is too weak and in too much pain to continue looking. Distraught, he decides to head back to his bed. After a moment of lying in the bed, he stares at the ceiling and slips off into a deep, uneasy sleep. Chapter 10. End of the line. Frank wakes up from a long sleep to the sound of the drip, drip, drip from the leaking faucet. He rolls onto his side, and a sharp pain from his missing arm shoots through his body. He had almost forgotten what had happened. He begins to silently sob. Once he composes himself, he notices the temperature has dropped significantly. At some point while he was sleeping, the logs had burned up, leaving only embers behind. He relights the fireplace using all the wood except for 2 small logs. He decides to use the 2 logs in the wood-burning stove to make some food. He clumsily whips up some scrambled eggs and cooks them while trying to get used to the functioning without his left arm. Once finished, he sits down at the kitchen table and begins eating. He eats quietly, wishing he could talk to Rex. Sadness and despair well up inside him, threatening to crush him under their immovable weight. As he finishes eating his eggs, there's a faint sound of crying coming from outside. Dread spreads through him, hair standing on end, goosebumps sprouting across his skin. The crying gets louder and louder as it moves towards the small hut. He sets his fork down and slowly rises from the chair. He approaches the window and squints out into the snow-blown field surrounding his yard. There is the dark shape of a figure moving through the field, trudging through the snow on its way to his home. Fear grips at Frank as he continues to stare at the approaching figure. Thoughts of the old lady creep into his mind, but something was different about this figure, something familiar. As the figure gets closer and closer, and the crying gets louder and louder, a memory of Amy, his long-dead sister, pops into his head, and he realizes why the figure seems familiar. Snow appears to repel away from her as she moves up and onto the front yard of the cabin. He takes a step back from the window, feeling scared and alarmed by the figure. He rushes over to grab the iron poker and then returns to the window a moment later to observe the woman, but to his surprise, she isn't anywhere to be seen. He hurries over to the front door and slowly opens it, sticking his head out and looking around. "Amy? Is that you?" he asks unwillingly, knowing it couldn't be her, yet something compelled him to seek her out, to find her, to save her from the blizzard and the cold. Flashes of the memory of Amy getting swallowed up by the avalanche pierce into his mind. Images of her screaming and slowly suffocating under the layers of densely packed snow. A scream out in the field draws his attention, and he looks out towards the tree line. He makes out the silhouette of the woman running through the snow towards the forest, running from a pack of wolves. His stomach lurches as he charges out into the blizzard in a desperate attempt to reach her, to save her. Having no concern for his own safety, he chaotically flings himself towards the forest. He trudges through the snow drifts and gusts of winds with only one mission, to get to Amy. After an exhausting, freezing, and numbing run through the long expanse of field, Frank finally arrives at the forest line. There is no sign of her, and the screaming has ceased. He stands there waiting and listening while holding his breath in anticipation. His bootless feet, succumbing to the cold, were barely able to hold him upright. He suddenly realizes where he is and gives a panicked look back towards the cabin, barely visible through the intense snow. As he is about to turn back, the sound of Amy's screaming reverberates from within the trees. He charges on, deeper and deeper into the forest, into the cold. Nothing else matters to him except to get to Amy. The forest is pitch black, and he failed to bring a flashlight or even a jacket. Shivering uncontrollably, he tumbles to the ground, his feet finally becoming disabled from the lack of warmth, no feeling left in them now. He struggles to remain upright by balancing on his knees. In a sorrowful rage, he looks up into the swirling snow of the blizzard and screams, "You win! I give up! Come and take me!" A small amount of moonlight has pierced through the clouds now and faintly illuminated the forest around him. As he looks back down from the sky, he catches sight of the old woman staring at him, peering at him from behind a tree, as if waiting for something. A loud, blaring howl of a wolf sounds out close behind him. He spins around, falling into a seated position as a pack of large wolves emerge from the darkness of the trees. The end.